if you are in a position to do so, and let's go. For the ones that don't know me, if you're still trying to place my accent, and if you're like, oh, I'm sure that girl is from Newcastle, well, no, I'm French. I've moved to the UK 14 years ago now, and I've never went back. Right. So we are just crossing the River Wye here. The River Wye goes into, it goes all the way to Weybridge, and then it goes into the Thames. It's quite a fairly clean river. You can actually swim. There's a little spot here in Guildford where you can swim. I've been telling my former boss that I was going to come and swim one day in the summer, but I've still never done it. And right here on the River Wye here, that's where they used to have the ducking stool. The ducking stool, let me show you an image in the chat. That was those horrible chairs that they would use in the Middle Ages to humiliate any ladies that was accused of gossiping or accused of complaining too much or accused of being what they would have called at the time a strumpet, or maybe cheating on their husband as well, or maybe bad traders as well. If they for example, if they were selling bread that was no good, or brewing beer that was no good, they could be put on the ducking stool. And it was really humiliating and also very scary, because for us today, I mean, being on the stool I don't know, if it was in south of Spain, it could actually almost be fun. But here it's freezing. And very few people knew how to swim at the time. So that was, no men. Yes, Michael, it has happened. And I think the men, they used to have their bums out. But most of the time it was ladies. And it could be for really random complaints, like just gossiping or just complaining about anything. So, today it's like today pretty much anyone on Facebook could be on the donkey stool, because we all complain all the time online. So yeah, quite a terrible thing that could happen to you. And this is the Yvonne Arnaud Theatre. It's a beautiful theatre. And next to it, it's a School of Acting. Apparently, that used to be the site of a mortuary as well back in the days. There's a little water mill underneath. And so, as the name says, it was a mill using the water power from the river. Anyway, let me tell you a bit more about... Oh, you're from Guildford, Claire. Amazing. So we are about 27 miles southwest of London. We are in Surrey. And Guildford historically was fairly important because we were halfway between London and the capital. The capital at the time was Winchester. So it was on the Pilgrim's Way as well. The pilgrims would go from Winchester to Canterbury, and they'll often stop in Guildford. So there were a lot of footfall. And the Saxons, they settled here in the 6th century. We actually have some evidence that some of the Saxons were in Surrey before the Roman left. Some of the Saxons arrived there in the year 300. Not in Guildford, but in Surrey in general. So it's a very old place. And let's go down into Peaspot Alley. Today, it's called Rosemary Alley. It has been renamed because Peaspot was not quite as exciting. But this used to be called Peaspot Alley because back in the days, well, at the time of when you still had those latrines and people dropping the chamber pots through the window, and they'll be shouting, "God, hello," and they'll be dropping down all that. Well, down here, apparently, it was like an open sewer. Everything would be kind of going down all the way into the River Wye. So that's why they called it Peaspot Alley. And it's actually quite ironic to have renamed it Rosemary because, of course, rosemary, that was used to cover the bad smells, like when they believed in the miasma fairy, when they believed that the diseases were being transmitted by bad smells, they would use rosemary. This is number 8. It's meant to be haunted, but I only like the ghost stories when we have some ideas of the contendant of who might be the ghost. And this one, they don't know. It's just some strange happenings. Anyway, let me go up and I'll turn around so you can see how skinny really the street is at the top. Let me show you. You go, sir. You'd love your address to be Peace Pot Alley. Well, actually, that'd be quite cool, especially when you ring to get a pizza and you're like, hey, pepperoni, please. Where do you live? Oh, Peace Pot Alley. Anyway, can you see there's hardly it's like pretty much 30 centimeters or 20 centimeters between the buildings at the top. So that's quite cool. We are in the oldest part of town. Down there, we have a church, St. Mary. They have a Saxon tower. So that's very old. That's where Lewis Carroll used to go and preach. If I come back to Guildford, I might do a little snippet about Lewis Carroll. We might go to his grave, but we might wait until the weather is a bit nicer so we can do it a bit later. Anyway, this is one of the oldest pubs in here and definitely the most haunted. This is the King's Head. The King's Head is, according to the staff, they have 3 ghosts. One of them, it's a man on a chair. He doesn't do much. He just sits on a chair. There's also apparently an older lady in the basement, in the cellar. And apparently she's quite nice, the older ghost. She kind of keeps an eye on the pumps. And sometimes you might be walking alone behind the bar and you can hear, Foster's out. They believe it's the ghost. And there's another ghost, a third one, that is said to be a little girl. And they've nicknamed the little girl Mary. Now, there had been so many sightings of those ghosts that they had to call a psychic. And according to the psychic lady, there were only 2 ghosts. She's not come across the men. And there's effectively one in the basement. And the little girl, Mary, she's not a little girl. According to the psychic, spirits in a pub, yeah. According to the medium lady, you go, don't worry. According to the lady, the Mary, she's not actually a child. She was described as a child that was dressed up with a Victorian dress. Apparently, she's not actually a child. She's she was 32 when she died, and she hates men because apparently, according to the psychic, again, she would have been pushed into a fireplace. Who knows? Laura, no, I don't have the name of that particular medium now. Anyway, if you guys bear with me for a second, I'm just going to have to swap SIM card because from now on, it's actually better on my other SIM card. So bear with me. That's going to be less than... There we go. We should be back on the second SIM card. And from now on, it's going to be much better on this one. Are we all good? Am I all back? Lovely. Perfect. So, Guilford it was a site that was very important back in the days because of its castle. So the castle was built by William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror, he had the idea he kind of moved the capital from Winchester to London. He built, of course, the Tower of London. And strategically, he built 9 little castles about 1 day away from the tower, 1 day away walk from London. So if you see a little bit of green behind the gate there, that's the castle keep. But even before William the Conqueror, actually, when William the Conqueror came over in 1066, the Normans, we can say they had a bit of a revenge because of what happened about 30 years earlier. here in Guildford, there was a horrible massacre that happened in 1036. Now, if you want to understand the context, focus for the next 2 minutes because I need to explain it. It's quite complicated. The King of England at the time, well, he wasn't really the King of England. He was the King of Wessex. At the time of the Saxons, we had a lot of little kingdoms like Essex, Sussex, Wessex, Cumbria, Northumbria. And by the turn of the first millennium, we can say that the kingdom of Wessex was pretty much in charge of all England. And the King of Wessex, his name was Nathalie the Unready. Nathalie was married to a French lady. She was quite smart, as most of the French ladies, and she gave him 2 sons, Alfred and Edward. Edward, much later on, became Edward the Confessor. And when Nathalie the Unready died, Knut was a Dane, he was a Viking, he took over the throne. So Emma, she married Knut. So Emma of Norway, she had married one king of England, and then she married the next one. And with Knut, she had a son, Artaknut. But the thing is, Knut had a bastard before Emma. He had another son, Harold Harefoot, not to be confused with Harold Godwinson. That's the one that took an arrow in the eye at Hastings and lost under William the Conqueror. No, not the same Harold. So when Knut himself died, it was very messy because the heir to the throne was technically Artaknut. But Artaknut, he was busy in Denmark fighting a battle. So, they did not want to leave the throne unattended. So they wanted to put his older brother, the one that was illegitimate, they wanted to put him in charge for the time being. So Harold Harefoot took the power. So that's the keep behind the trader. And he was meant to be in charge only for a few months until his brother came back. But Emma, the Queen Dowager, she could clearly see that Harold was going to try to keep the throne for himself. And he went down to Winchester and he took all the valuable goods, the royal goods from the Queen. So the Queen, being really worried, she wanted to protect the interest of her son, Harthacnut. She called her 2 sons from Normandy, Alfred and Edward. Remember the sons from the first marriage with Nathalie the Unready. Now, that's just to set the context. Hopefully you followed that. I know it's a complicated one. So she called Edward and Alfred to come and help her, just to protect the interest of Harthacnut. And the boys came. Well, actually, we don't know for sure whether Edward came at all, or if he went all the way to Southampton and then went back to Brittany. What we do know is that Alfred came, and he came with nearly 200 men. Officially, he was not trying to invade at all. He was coming to help his mum. And at the time, there was a very powerful lord in Wessex called Earl Godwin. Well, he's actually the dad of Harold Godwinson, the one that took the throne later on. And Godwin was a great defender of Harthacnut. So he came and welcomed Alfred at the port, and he invited Alfred and his men to come here to Guildford to have a night of celebration. They had a feast with a lot of alcohol, a lot of meat, a lot of street performers and potentially ladies of the night. A big feast, big party, and then they went to sleep into their tents. And through the night, the 200 Normans, they woke up with an axe on their throat. They had been all their weapons were removed. They have been chained. They were taken into Landfield a bit further on the moat, and they were, tortured, scalped. It was a horrible massacre. Most of them were executed, and they were defenseless. They really did not expect that. So when you see, exactly like the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, yeah, exactly. Officially, the Red Wedding is inspired by the Glencoe massacre in the Highlands. I think the Guildford one might have also played a part. So horrible massacre. 1 out of 10 only was spared, and they might have been sold for slavery. And Alfred technically was spared, but they plucked out his eyes from his eyes sockets, and he died of the following injuries. So horrible massacre. And what happened here in 1929? On the month, we had a little landlord that was doing some gardening in his back gardens. He wanted to extend his rose garden. Well, he came across the remains of about 200 men. So most historians at the time believed it was the remains of the 200 Normans that were killed. Um, it's very possible, but it's actually very debatable. I spent a lot of time at the Guildford Library, and I found a book that contradicted everything. Apparently, on one of the human remains, they found a coin that was 7 years too old. It was Saxon, but it was from 1043. So there could be different remains, or there might be an explanation. They might have moved the remains at some point. Who knows? But yeah. Anyway, horrible massacre. So when you see those TV shows like, Game of Thrones or even The Last Kingdom is about this part of history. So yeah, it's sometimes history can actually rival with the fiction. Oh, you love The Last Kingdom? Cool. So do I. Anyway, we are now on another site that is haunted by a ghost. Her name is Lorna. Lorna, she's the most active ghost in Guildford. She's been seen everywhere. She's been seen entering that very shop here. She's been seen in a car park when they were building it. She's been seen on the road there, Sydenham Road. And she's also been seen in that little alleyway there, Milk House. And there's absolutely no references or any record of any of that, but there's a little local legend. They believe they know what happened to Lorna. She would have lived in the late 1600s when we started to have a lot of Quakers in Guildford. The Quakers, if you don't know, they were those people that were very different in terms of religion. In the 1600s, religion was not an option. You'd have to go to your church and stuff. And they believed they did not have to go to the Church of England. They believed they could pray themselves, that there was no need for bishops or archbishops. They were, in a way, they were very modern in terms of religion. A lot of them were abolitionists as well. And anyway, Lorna lived here with a dad, a Quaker. He was a widow, so she had lost her mum. And very fond of porridge, yes. Some might not know why we're laughing. I think it's a very British brand. But yes. Anyway, the thing with Lorna is that she had a boyfriend that was a Church of England. He was an Anglican. And her dad had made it quite clear that if the relationship was going to develop, he wanted the young man to convert, to become a Quaker as well. And one night he was invited for Christmas lunch, Christmas Eve, and not a big one because the Quakers didn't really celebrate Christmas too much. And apparently the young man and the dad had a quarrel. The dad was way too pushy. He was asking a lot of questions about religion and pushing the young man. And eventually the young man had enough. He left and he just left. Then Lorna, well, obviously she had an argument with her dad. We don't know what was being said, but she probably told him, "You've ruined my life." And she stormed out as well. Now, her dad was not necessarily massively worried because he believed she might have run after him and she might have spent the night with him. Apparently, she did not. She did not come back that night, but the next morning they found her. She had fallen down next to the castle. There was a bit of a cliff. She had fallen down, broken many bones, and she was frozen. They took her back to her dad's place, but she died the same day of her injuries. And apparently, her dad was still so crossed with her that he would have refused that she got buried in Quaker's Acre. I'll show you at the end of the tour, actually, where that was. That's a little burial ground. So they think her ghost is still coming back. Yeah, it's very sad, but we don't even know if it's a true tale, Natasha. It's a little legend. Um, and even that shop here, well, we think it's that shop. Apparently, at some point, they used to sell clothes, and the one of the young ladies working as a shop assistant, she saw a blonde lady with a grey dress that was really rude. She walked into the shop and didn't even say hello, and she went straight upstairs. So the shop assistant followed her upstairs, and she had vanished. Then she called. She was so scared. She called her boss, and she was like, "Oh, there was a lady. She's disappeared." And her boss was like, "Oh, don't worry, girl. You've just seen Lorna. Everyone sees her once every so often." So yeah, she's a very active local ghost, but we don't know if there's any truth behind the story. Anyway, we are now in Tunsgate, beautiful archway to nowhere. Well, it goes into the high street, and it's from the 1880s. But before that, it used to be a spot for the executions here. And let me show you. There's a lovely little mosaic on the floor. So the Fribourg, it's a town in Germany. They are the sister town with Guilford, and this is the Guilford crest or armories. So that's quite a cool one with the lion and the castle. Oh, we still on the Quakers, on the porridge, cool. So yeah, this side here, across the street, it's the Guildhall, but I'll tell you a bit more about the Guildhall in a moment. And this site here, that was the site of a massive miscarriage of justice. Um, in October 1708, there was a young man. His name was Christopher Slaughterford. Slaughterford, that's a good name for a killer, if he was indeed a killer. He um, he had a girlfriend called Jane Young, a beautiful young girl, and Jane worked as a servant. But uh, she had told her employer that she was leaving the job because she was going to marry Slaughterford, and they were seen walking into the park, Loseley Park, just outside of Guildford, and there were quite a few witnesses that saw them together, and then she disappeared. Now, Christopher was, of course, worried. And as the days went past, and even a couple of weeks, everyone started to accuse him of murder. And eventually, well, at the beginning, it was just gossip, but then people started shouting at him on the street. So Christopher went himself, he went to see the authorities, and he was like, I'm being accused of murder. My girlfriend disappeared. You should investigate. And they said, no, go home, Christopher. She'll be back eventually. And eventually she was found. She was found quite close to the location where they were last seen together. Her body was being quite badly decomposed. It was nearly a month later, and apparently there were still traces of strangulation. So that time it was no longer gossip anymore. Christopher was being accused by anyone, although there was nothing against him really apart from the circumstances. So he went himself and he asked to be tried. So he was tried and he was acquitted because the evidence were extremely flaky, and the witnesses as well. So he was acquitted. However, Jane's brother, he raised up some money for a second trial. And that second trial, a private trial, was exactly the same flaky evidence, exactly the same witnesses, but he was then convicted of murder. Now, he was actually very unlucky because at that time, under the reign of Queen Anne, there was a very strange law that if you had been convicted into a private trial, because it was not a state case, the monarch could not intervene. So he could not ask for any royal pardons or anything. And he was hanged. They placed the gallows behind me at the archway there. And apparently, the day of the execution, it was on a Sunday morning. People would be on their way to church and everything. He did the last little speech. He told everyone that he was innocent, and he told people that he forgave his enemies, and then he jumped. So technically, he kind of committed suicide rather than being executed. And since that day, many people have seen him around. Um, his employee, his servant has seen him. His landlady as well. His aunt, she had a sighting of him as she was milking a cow. And also a chap called Roger Valley. He was the guy that one of the main accusers. Apparently, once he was walking here on the high street, when he felt a cold feeling behind him, he turned around, and it was the ghost. It was the ghost of Slaughterford. He recognized him because he was still wearing the same outfit, and apparently he had a noose around his neck. So yeah, in the 90s, by the way, they also filmed a movie here, a little documentary called The Pilgrim's Way. And as they were recreating the hanging, there were also quite a lot of interesting, weird experiences as well. So maybe Christopher might still be hunting the streets. Apparently, the signal has dropped a little. Can you still see the building, the beautiful building here? This is the Angel. It's a coaching house. You can see, okay, good, because it's telling me 1 out of 5. Okay, good. So that's one of those old coaching house, amazing building. So, back in the days, before the trains and everything, if you wanted to go across the country, you'd have to go on one of those horse and carriages, coaches, and they used to stop um, in some like a hotel basically for the night. And this one was very busy because again we were halfway between the seaside and Winchester and London, and on the Pilgrim's Way, so very busy inn. And the ghost story really came in the 60s, well, in 1969 to be precise, when a lady, she booked room number 1 upstairs, and uh, uh, she went upstairs, and then she called reception, and she didn't say anything. And the receptionist was a bit worried, really, because why would she call and say nothing? So the receptionist went upstairs, and she knocked at the door. No answers. So she didn't know whether she could open it or not. She opened the door. She pushed the door quite slowly, and the lady was there. She was stood right in the middle of the room, not moving, and the telephone was still in her hand. She could not speak, she could not move. And when she was finally able to speak again, she said, there was a man in the room, there was a man, and then I saw him in the mirror, he was looking at me, a man with a mustache. So the lady asked to be transferred to a different bedroom, which was of course agreed, and they didn't think much of it. A year later, in 1970, Mr. and Mrs. Dell from Bayswater in London came over here to spend the night in room number 1. Through the night, Mr. Dell could not sleep very well. So he did not want to wake his wife. So instead of moving in the bed over and over again, he stood up and he went to sit on the sofa. Now, from the sofa, he looked at, there was a cabinet with a mirror. And looking at him in the mirror was a man with a mustache, looking a bit like a soldier, Eastern European soldier. And he stared at the man, like just checking that his eyes were not deceiving him. And there was a man there. So he woke up his wife. And the wife first looked at the mirror. At first, she couldn't see anything. And then she saw it. There was a man with a mustache. So now Mr. Dell grabbed a napkin and he drew a sketch of the man. Let me show you a cleaned up version of the sketch. So that's the man that they saw in the mirror. Then a few years later, there was an actor that was he was in a play at the theater that we've seen earlier, and he was there for 3 nights. And 3 nights in a row, he could see a man in the room, and he did not see the reflection in the mirror, but the Bible opened on its own when he was not looking. And apparently, when the receptionist came in, she was like, "Oh, that's interesting that he opened the Bible on this page because he doesn't like that verse of the Bible, the ghost." So the receptionist also knew about the ghost. And later on, a few years later, another actress called Petula Clark, she also booked room number 1, and again she saw a man in the mirror, a man with a mustache. Now, some people might argue that they've got rid of that cabinet. So, have I seen any ghosts? Suzanne, ask me again at the end of the tour, when we finish the tour. So the cabinet was gone, but some said that there might have been some kind of a portrait or some kind of a poster behind the mirror. And that could be some kind of visual effect people could see maybe behind the mirror. Who knows? In the 90s, in 98 to be precise, they were filming a show called the Files. And then even more ghosts came to the surface in the show. Some people also claim that they had seen the ghost of a nun. We have to be careful when people say they see the ghost of a nun, because it might not be a nun. In medieval times, every married ladies might be wearing some kind of a hoodie, so they might look like a nun without being a nun. Anyway, the building across the street here is apparently also haunted. At some point, there were some builders doing some refurbishment in the building, and they were commuting, not sure from where, maybe potentially London. And instead of paying for the train every day, because that can be quite expensive, that's what I used to do, they decided to sleep in the building in sleeping bags so they could work a bit later and start a bit earlier in the morning, and the job would be done quicker. Well, apparently at night, they could hear some rustling noises, like the noises of a crinoline dress. Now, I don't know about you, but I did not even know that crinoline dresses, they were making any type of noises. So I find it hard to believe that some builders in the 50s would recognize the noise of a crinoline dress. But if they say so, why not? And apparently as they destroyed some of the walls inside, they found a little bricked up room with another bricked up wall inside, and in which they found, Leonie, close your ears for a second, 8 skeletal remains of cats. Now, finding the remains of one cat is not unusual. We have spoken about that in some of my tours before. It was a medieval practice called immurement. Immurement, it's when you put in a wall the remains of an animal to avoid the misfortune. So they quite often use cats. Finding one is not rare, but finding 8, they must have been really worried about what might happen in that building. So who knows? And apparently in the 80s, some girls, young actresses as well, they were students at the School of Acting down there, they rented the rooms upstairs, and they could also hear some really weird noises, like the noise of a crinoline dress again. But those girls were actresses, so they might have had some crinoline dresses in their collection of outfit at the theater. So those girls, why not? But the builders, I'm like, yeah, right. Anyway, let me show you the Guildhall. Beautiful building. It was rebuilt because Elizabeth I came to visit the town in the 1500s. So the building is from the 1500s, but the facade is actually from the 1680s. And So the guild hall, that's where you'd have those association of traders. So that's where you'd have to come and pay some kind of a fee if you wanted to open a shop on the high street. And there was a little clockmaker called John Halen. He could not afford the fee, so he had to open a shop outside of the high street. So he was gutted, and he decided to build an amazing clock gilded with gold, and he gifted it to the guild hall. So to say thank you, they gave him a membership, so he was then able to have a shop on the street. So that's the little story behind the clock. So that's quite cool. Yeah, and it's amazing at night. Some buildings look better at night, some buildings look better at daytime, but the Guildhall is amazing at night. Anyway, let's let's go and take a look at the Habbott's hospital. John Habott, George, sorry, is he was an Archbishop of Canterbury. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is basically the big boss in the church. Well, after the monarch. The head of the church is the monarch, but the Archbishop of Canterbury is like the big boss. And he was from Guildford. He was born at the bottom of the street here. John Habott, by the way, is the only Archbishop of Canterbury that ever killed somebody. It was an accident, crossbow. He went hunting and he misfired his crossbow, and he actually killed a gentleman. So anyway, a very interesting building. When I say hospital, think about hospitality, really. Back in the days, hospitals were not like today. They were more like a place for people to come on rest and be welcomed. Anyway, that's the building. It's a shame that it's not lit up at night, because it's an amazing Tudor building. Well, Jacobean really, but it looks a bit like Hampton Court. Let me just give you a last view from here on the Guildhall, because it's quite nice on this side as well. And guess what? The Habott Hospital is haunted as well. It is a room that they call the Monmouth room. I believe it's just there in the middle, the top level. Monmouth, after the Duke of Monmouth. Why has my signal dropped here? It's usually good here. The Duke of Monmouth was the first bastard son of Charles II. Charles II, we spoke about him before in many of my tours. He was known as the Merry Monarch. He had many mistresses, a lot of illegitimate children, and he. Why am I? I'm not sure why the signal has dropped. It was usually good here, but hey ho. So yeah, he had many mistresses, and with his first mistress, he had a son, James Scott, and James was convinced that he was the heir to the throne. He wasn't, because he was illegitimate, and when Charles II died, the throne went to Charles' brother, James II. James II was a Catholic. And that was a bit of an issue, because we did not want any Catholics on the throne. Well, although officially Charles II was a Protestant, but on his deathbed, he called the Catholic priest. So anyway, the crown went to James II, but some people were not happy with that. And the Duke of Monmouth, he was convinced that his mum and dad had secretly married. That's what his mum had told him. It's probably not true. She probably just said that to her little boy, so she did not want to be a fallen lady in his eyes, And according to Charles, it's definitely not true. He was only married to his wife. But the Duke was then convinced he was the rightful heir to the throne, and he came to invade England with his troops in the 1680s, and he was stopped by the Duke of Marlborough. He was actually in Somerset when he was stopped, and they brought him back to London, where he was executed at the Tower of London And on their way, they stopped here at the Abbott Hospital. Abbott is here, by the way, so that's his statue, George Abbott. Let me show you. He's holding a Bible because he contributed to the traduction of the Bible from Latin into English, and under the time of James. By the way, a bit down there, we're not going to go all the way because there's not much to see, but there's a grammar school dating back to Tudor times. A grammar school, we called it grammar school because it was where you'd learn Latin grammar, basically, because at the time all the official texts on the Bibles, they were all in Latin. So in the grammar schools, you'd learn Latin. And the school is haunted as well. Apparently, they have a ghost in the staircase, a rider that went on the staircase with a horse. Anyway, back to the Duke of Monmouth. So he was taken here to the hospital before to be executed at the Tower. The execution of the Duke of Monmouth, by the way, it was a disaster. So they took him to the Tower, and the executionist at the time, they used to be tipped. So James gave a large tip to the executionist, and he said, "Do a good job, because I know you didn't do so well with my friend the other day. It took several blows." So he gave him a big tip, and he said, "If you kill me in one blow, my servant would give you more." And the executionist was so bad. He was probably very drunk, but it was a hard job, So often they'll have a few drinks before. And he did a first blow, and he was on the shoulder. Then he tried again, and he missed again 5 times. And eventually, James's head was still attached. His head was half cut. And eventually the executionist went, "Oh, that's enough. I can't have this anymore." And he got out of his pocket a pocket knife, and he finished the Duke with his pocket knife. And apparently, as the Duke was killed, they were like, "Oops, crap, we don't have a portrait of him." "Oh, because he's a royal, he's the son of a king. They should have done a portrait." That's not actually true. They had many portraits on the continent because he used to live in France and Holland, but they didn't have any portraits in the UK. So apparently they said that they reattached his head to paint a last portrait. It is debatable. That's a little urban myth, but according to the National Gallery, it might be this portrait. So it's not actually a sitting down portrait. It's literally him on his deathbed. Who knows? It's not sure, but that's what the National Gallery believes. And he's said to be hunting the Monmouth room here. He's said to be hunting all the buildings in which he passed on his way to the Tower. Anyway, we have some amazing little painted mosaics here to remember Abbott. So that's him there, and that's the Abbott Hospital. And let me show you the plague. And so that's quite cool. We've got 4 of them. That's the other side of the building, I believe. And the school, by the way, I didn't even tell you, the scooter. The school, apparently, it's the first place where cricket was recorded, the game of cricket. It was mentioned in an inquiry from the coroner in some kind of crime. They said next to the pitch where those boys were playing crickets in the 1500s. So quite an old game. Anyway, let's go down towards a former pub. Apologies, it's a very sad and very shocking story. But I decided to tell you anyway because it's such a fascinating case. So in the 70s, we had a lot of terrorism in Ireland and in England from the IRA. So for the ones that don't know, that was the Irish Republican Army. They basically wanted Britain out of Northern Ireland. So they bombed quite a few buildings and they killed many innocents. And that's exactly what happened here. I think it's 5th of October 1974. There was a pub here in Guildford that was targeted, mainly because a lot of the customers in the pub were actually soldiers. The IRA, they saw themselves as soldiers. They saw themselves as, they believed it was a war. One can argue that the difference between war and terrorism is not, strong. Anyway, they bombed the pub. 5 innocent victims died and many were injured. And yeah, exactly. It's the provisional IRA because there's different. Yeah, let's not get into that because it would be very complicated to explain. And also, I'm probably not the best one to explain it. But yeah. And so that's the building across the street here that sadly was bombed. The five victims were not the only ones that had their lives destroyed. Unfortunately, there was a massive miscarriage of justice. Exactly, Jennifer, the Guilford Four. What happened is there was, the most famous of the Guilford Four, his name was Jerry Conlon. He was from Ireland, and he was a bit of a bad boy. He was a petty criminal, and I mean, by all accounts, he was a bit of a thief, but he was not part of the IRA at all. And because he was being too naughty in Belfast, his dad kind of tried to tell him to go to London to live with his aunt for the time being and kind of start a new life. He moved to London, and on the boat, he ran into his mate Paul. So the two of them moved to London. Another one of their friend Patrick had invited them into a squat. Jerry was meant to go and live with his aunt, but he wanted to party, he wanted to do drugs, and when you lived with your aunt, you couldn't really do that. So he moved into a squat. Yes, exactly. There's an amazing, very interesting movie called In the Name of the Father. And there's a play as well called In the Name of the Son, and a book called Proven Innocent. So Jerry moved to London, and he moved into this squat with a lot of people, hippies. They were doing a lot of drugs and peace and love. And Jerry was quite attractive, and he was getting all the girls. And apparently at the squat, one of the boys was quite jealous of him. And that night, on the 5th of October, Jerry was not here in Guildford at all. He was actually in London when he met an Irish homeless on a bench. And the homeless said, "Go home, son, go home. If you stay here in London, you'll end up like me." And Jerry indeed believed it was time for him to go home, but he did not have any money. Then a few days later, he witnessed a sex worker that was leaving her flat, and she dropped her keys and jumped into a cab. Jerry grabbed the keys and he went into her flat and he stole £700. I'm not sure how much that would be. At the time, that was much more than today, 700. So he used that to go home. And the next thing you know, in Belfast, the police is knocking at the door. They came to grab him in his bed. He was brought to the police station, and they had just passed out a law a few weeks earlier that in the case of terrorism, people could be interrogated non-stop for 7 days. So Jerry was arrested, as well as his 3 other friends. Carol, I think Carol was not even Irish. I think she was English. Carol, Patrick, and Paul. And they were interrogated, imagine, for 7 days, non-stop, no sleep, many officers, and they were, they were violent, very violent with them, and very intimidating as well. And eventually, to make it stop, they were being beaten up. They were half naked. I mean, crazy. You cannot even imagine the police doing that, but they did. Eventually, the 4 of them confessed just to make it stop. They knew they had done nothing, but 7 days. Imagine 7 days of being slapped and eventually they confessed. They were tried, but they were used as scapegoats, really. Um, Jerry was convicted of 30 years, and apparently the judge was like, "Oh, I would have been happy to hang you." So, crazy miscarriage of justice. In the uh, Let me show you the names of the victims. I think they're here. In About 5 days later, that's down here actually. The actual soldier, they called themselves soldiers. The actual soldier from the IRA that had done the bombing was caught for different bombings, and he said to the police, he said, "Well, you can put me down for Guilford as well. That was me." The police did not care. And actually, the four, they all had some alibis. The alibis were kind of hidden away. And not only the four were arrested, but all Jerry's family was also arrested, the Maguire Seven. His dad, Giuseppe, went to prison. He died in prison. His aunt, that had nothing to do with, none of that. All of them went to prison as well. And eventually, finally, he had a good lawyer that was able to find the police evidence that was hidden. And eventually, in 1989, he was released. That's him on his day when he was released from prison, when he came out of the Old Bailey free. So yeah, a crazy case, crazy case. I don't even know if we can call it a miscarriage of justice or just a massive cover-up. They were used as scapegoats, and the police convicted officers, they were not convicted of anything. So yeah, terrible case. Very sad, but interesting story, really. Yeah, well, not corruption. I think that they just wanted to blame somebody, and those poor boys were Irish, And what happened is, the one that was jealous, the other hippie guy at the squat, he went to the police and he said, my squatters, my friends, they've done it. They're definitely, they're nasty, they're Irish, they've done it. I know they've done it. So the police decided, instead of investigating, I mean, they had never even been to Guildford. Instead of investigating, they decided to take the word of a hippie, a drunken high hippie, and put so many innocents in prison. So yeah, he died. Yeah, he died not that long ago, Sailor. Yeah, exactly. Scapegoats. Well, some people today still believe that he might have been guilty, but that's no, there's literally nothing against him. Anyway, this is, when we were talking about Lorna earlier, I mentioned Quaker Acre. That's the spot. That's the little burial ground. It's now a little park, but that's where the Quakers used to be buried. Let me show you the name, Quaker's Acre. Anyway, that's gonna be the end of the tour. Yes, there were also the Birmingham Six. Yeah, there were quite a few people put in prison for years and completely innocent. And yeah, and I mean, even when he got out, Jerry could not cope. Apparently, he became friend with Johnny Depp. But he became addicted to crack, and he never fully recovered. Anyway, that's